the first webinar of second AIWW on air. I'm going to summarize very briefly what we discussed during the second AIWW on air opening. There are many, high-level celebrities participated. First of all, the minister from the Korea, China, Uzbekistan, the Cambodia, and as well as AIW's president and the treasurer. Specifically, all of the ministers focus on the second AIWW. They're going to support very well to prepare the second AIWW. And also specifically the vice president of ADB participated, and he mentioned the ADO, Asia Water Development Outlook 2020. And also that is, 5 key recommendations. The first one, make water center to sustainable rural development, urban water security, healthy environment, and resilience, and resources and good governance. And I think the Asia Water Council can use this kind of good approach to solve the Asia Water problem. And also the AWC president mentioned the second AIWW important thing. The planning director, mentioned, second AIWW is the great way to solve Asia Water problem and also accomplish SDG 6 2030, and that's going to be we can make a great support, something like that. And also the AIWC, Asia Water National Water Consultative Board, the president and treasurer participated, and also they're gonna participate the second AIWW, and working the kind of as you know, some kind of the statement session, and also they want to make some the great opportunity to solve Asia Water problem with AWC and expert. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. So, as the main beginning of the stage of this event, I'd like to introduce our Executive Vice President of Canberra, Dr. Kab-sik. He has experience in water sectors more than 30 years, and he has been working involved in water tariff and water supply, water business, and so on. So please welcome him with a big round of applause.
안녕하십니까. K-워터 기기사 김갑식입니다. 바쁘신 와중에도 제1회 아시아 워터 이슈 지속 가능한 발전을 위한 물 세션에 참석해 주신 특별위원회 분과장, 패널 여러분 대단히 감사드리겠습니다. 아시아 워터 이슈는 아시아 지역 또 나아가 국제사회와 물 문제를 함께 공유하고 해결 방안을 찾는 데 의미가 있다고 생각합니다. 우리가 직면한 물 문제는 하나의 국가 혹은 기관이 해결할 수 없는 문제이기에 각기 다른 관점과 역량을 지닌 이해관계자들의 협업이 반드시 필요하다고 생각합니다. 이 같은 요구에 부응하고자 2015년 제7차 세계 물 포럼에서 AWC 설립을 선언하고 16년 3월에 AWC를 창립하기에 이르렀습니다. 현재 AWC는 각국 정부, 공공기관, MDB, 학계 및 연구기관, 국제기구와 NGO, 기업 등 144개의 다양한 이해관계자가 참여하는 아시아 대표 물 협력 플랫폼으로 성장하였습니다. AWC는 워터 프로젝트를 통해 실질적인 물 문제를 해결하기 위해 노력하고 있으며 아시아 물복지 향상과 지속가능 발전 목표 달성을 위해서 아시아 국가들 간의 협력을 강화하고 있습니다. 금년 11월 인도네시아에서 개최 예정인 아시아 국제 물주간의 대주제는 Clean and Sufficient Water for All입니다. 이를 실현하기 위해 지속 가능한 성장을 위한 물을 포함한 6개 주제를 선정하고 전문가 토의가 진행될 예정입니다. 본 세션은 2월 24일 오프닝에 이어 앞으로 6개월간 진행될 아시아 워터 이슈의 시작을 알리는 뜻깊은 자리라고 생각합니다. 이번 지속과 가능한 발전을 위한 물을 주제로 한 논의에서는 우리가 당면한 여러 물 문제에 대한 여러 국가 및 기관들이 집단 지성과 베스트 프랙티스를 공유하고 물 이용으로부터 얻는 이득을 공유함으로써 궁극적으로는 문제 해결을 위한 행동의지와 책임감을 공유할 것입니다. 저는 이번 세션을 통해서 논의된 주제들이 앞으로도 지속적으로 논의되고 개발되어지기를 원합니다. 오늘 논의된 주제는 다양한 물 전문가들에 의해 다시 한번 검증되고 개발되는 과정을 거쳐서 물 문제에 대한 최선책을 도출하고 공유할 수 있기를 바랍니다. 앞으로 6개월간의 AIWW on Air를 통해 차질 없는 준비를 하고 2021년 11월 인도네시아에서 개최될 제2차 AIWWA에서 지식공유와 파트너십을 통한 우리 성과를 전 세계 물 전문가들과 지식적으로 공유해 나갈 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 마지막으로 본 세션 준비를 위해 애쓰신 분들과 이번 세션에 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 깊은 감사를 드립니다. 세션을 통해 모든 분들이 소기의 성과를 이루시길 진심으로 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim.
I want to mention the excuse to you, and I think that because of the time limitation, the many participants are waiting continuously. So that I think that please try to to change the computer, and during that time, I'm gonna preside over our meeting. Okay. All right. Today's session is water for sustainable growth, and we prepared around 3 speakers will participate. And after finishing the speech session, we're going to have a panel discussion with moderator. Michael will come back again. And we have 3 experts. The first is Mr. Xavier from OECD, and Dr. Pichamon, Yeophantong from the UNSW Canberra. And lastly, from Indonesian side, Isnaili Murdi Hartanto from MPWH. First of all, I would like to introduce Xavier, Mr. Xavier Leflaive, and he will speech. He will present, some of the article. We will make a session for the second day AIWW. Mr. Xavier, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope the sound is okay.
Yes,
Can
good.
you not confirm?
Yes.
Yeah? Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for AWC for the invitation. It was also a pleasure to be part of a discussion with Michael from the Australian Water Partnership. I hope he can join later. I'll share my screen because I prepared a few slides. The focus of my presentation this morning will be on financing water security in Asia and the Pacific, and I'm going to share with you some of the work that we have been doing with the Asian Development Bank in the context of the Asia Water Development Outlook. As you may know, it was the first time that the Asia Water Development Outlook had a chapter on finance and another one on governance. And both these chapters were coordinated by the OECD. And I'm happy now to share some of the main results. Of course, there is more in the Outlook and in a working paper that the OECD is about to release by the end of March. So we will be happy to share when this is available. So the focus of the work was on 3 things. First, financing flows, trying to measure how much money is going into water security in Asia and the Pacific at national or regional level. Measuring financing needs and analyzing financing capacities. The point here is try to assess the gap between financing needs and capacities and discuss policy options to bridge that gap. The first message I would like to share with you is that in Asia, the only common ambition about water management is the SDGs, in particular SDG 6. That comes in this as a difference from other regions like Europe in particular, where European countries have set up common goals that go beyond SDGs at regional level. And it may be a message for countries in the region where there may be space here for further collaboration to set more specific goals, probably at sub-regional level, because Asia and Pacific is so big and diverse that sub-regional initiatives may be relevant. Converging towards similar level of ambition at sub-regional level could be very useful for countries also to emulate, to learn from one another, and to create a dynamic again at sub-regional level. Same thing, of course, because of the size and the diversity of the region, there is a lack of harmonized data. So a lot of things that we are going to that I'm going to share this morning should be taken with some caveat, because there are more work is needed to produce harmonized data that can allow comparison and benchmarking across countries in the region. As I said, there is an opportunity here, probably at sub-regional level, for further collaboration. So if you think about projected investment needs, our work has covered 3 domains. The first one is water supply and sanitation. And here there is some sort of a consensus that most countries will need to allocate between 1% and 2% of GDP to invest in water supply and sanitation in the next 20 years or in 10 or 15 years. Some countries are lagging behind and they will need to spend more to catch up. They are listed here. When it comes to flood protection, there really is a data issue, because it's very difficult to measure how much money is going into flood protection in the region. This is not specific to Asia and the Pacific. We faced a similar problem when we did the same exercise across European countries. So the proxy we used in the report is exposure to flood risks. And on that basis, you can see that some countries in the region are particularly vulnerable and particularly exposed to flood risks. And the ones which are listed there face flood risk that can exceed 6% of GDP by 2030. So at least we probably, we're not able to say how that translates into financing needs, but at least there is a very strong economic case to invest in flood protection. The third pillar of our work was on irrigation. And here there are needs to expand irrigated areas. An interesting message is that the areas that need to be expanded may not be the ones which are operating at the moment, because some of the irrigated areas at the moment may face issues vis-à-vis access to water. So if you take into account resource availability now and in the longer term, there may be a need to actually shift or transition towards other irrigated areas in some countries. And we understand that this can be very tricky. At the same time, there is a need to enhance irrigation efficiency. So it's not just about extension of irrigated areas, it's also about making a better use of water in irrigated areas. I'll skip that chart. Here you will see, this is a chart that we use quite often at the OECD to explain the difference between what we call the ultimate sources of finance or sources of funding and repayable finance. When it comes to financing, especially for water supply and sanitation, there are 3, if you think about it, there are only 3 ultimate sources of finance. These are tariffs, so revenues from tariffs, taxes from national or local government, and transfers from the international community, usually through official development assistance. There are, of course, other sources of finance that can be used, concessional finance, commercial finance, but these other sources of finance need to be paid back. And they will only be attracted in the water sector if there is, a financing mechanism to repay these other sources of finance. And these financing mechanisms will necessarily be a combination of tariffs, taxes, and transfers. So from that perspective, it's clear that commercial finance, to which some countries, look as some sort of a silver bullet, can only be accessible if you already have in place a robust combination of tariffs, taxes, and transfers, if appropriate. So if you characterize the three ultimate sources of finance in Asia and the Pacific, the first point about water tariffs is that they are underutilized in most countries in the region. Affordability acts as a barrier in selected countries, but very often affordability is overemphasized. I'm not saying that affordability is not an issue, but in most countries, the vast majority of the population could pay more. And it's actually much more effective to try to charge the vast majority of the people who can pay more and have targeted social measures for the poorest segment of the population. I won't have time to elaborate this morning unless there are questions, but I think this is a strong message. When it comes to taxes, public taxes remain the main source of finance for water-related infrastructure in Asia and the Pacific, which is not unusual, and it's not as such an issue, but it may be a matter of concern in the current context. If you think about the post-COVID environment, where public finance will be under severe pressure, there may be a concern because that money may be directed towards other priorities. At the same time, the post-COVID context may be an opportunity if water features in the recovery packages that countries are setting up. So that remains an open question, but something that should be considered thoroughly. And the third ultimate source of finance is official development assistance, which can be, which remains comparatively small vis-à-vis other sources of finance. So the point here is that ODA, it cannot be a substitute for taxes and tariffs. ODA should be used strategically to leverage and to crowd in other sources of finance. Another point about ODA is that it may not be targeted to the countries which are most in need of official development assistance. I have a couple of charts here that portrays characterizes how different countries rely on tariffs or taxes to finance water supply and sanitation. You see that the situation is quite diverse, but it's another message here is that out of the 48 or 49 countries in Asia, only we only have robust data for about half of them. So another point that more robust data and harmonized data is needed to compare countries in the region and to do some benchmarking. This is based on OECD data on official development assistance, where we compare, how much ODA countries reserve per capita. I'll skip that slide because of time, because I would like to focus more on the responses or policy options to address the challenges that I just mentioned. The core message here is that financing water security in Asia is not just about more money. There are other things that could be done to make the best use of available assets and financial resources, typically focusing attention to enhance the operational efficiency of service providers. That's critical because that can provide a better return on the money that is invested in these services, but also it can make these service providers more creditworthy, meaning that they then can have access to other sources of finance, in particular commercial finance. On this issue, there is a role for independent economic regulation, and I think this is an area where most countries in the region could invest some time and effort, and there are lessons to be learned from good practices in the region, but also outside of Asia. It's a domain that the OECD would be keen to explore further with you if there is an interest. Another set of action that should be considered is to avoid building future liabilities. We see too many investments in other domains, think about agriculture, urban development, or energy supply, which actually contribute to more exposure or more vulnerability to water-related risks instead of contributing to water security. So I won't go into the details here for lack of time, but the point here is that governments can do better in encouraging policy coherence across water and other policy domains, making sure that decisions which are made in terms of urban development, land use, or agriculture make sense from a water security perspective. Third pillar of action is to improve tools to plan and decide on investments and financing mechanisms. We think there is a lot that can be gained in the region in that front. And again, there are lessons to be learned on how to plan properly, how to reflect, climate change and other long-term trends into water security plans and infrastructure development. Innovation has a role to play in that context. And it's something that we would be keen, again, to explore, especially with our Korean colleagues. And finally, there are opportunities to harness additional sources of finance. But again, this is not the silver bullet. Most countries can do better with the money that is already available for water supply and sanitation services and for water resources management. So that's probably the key message I would like to emphasize again today, is that additional sources of finance may be needed, but it will be more, they will be more accessible when work has been done on the other pillars to ensure that financial resources are used in the most effective and cost-efficient way. I'll stop there, but I'd be happy to take any question at a later stage if we have time. We can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Xavier. Mr. Xavier mentioned many kind of way how to increase enhancing financing way to solve a water problem. For example, the water supply and sanitation, flood protection, and irrigation, and combining the financing way. Okay, so during the panel discussion that we'll discuss, and Michael, Mr. Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, thank you so much. It sounds really great, and you can be working as a moderator from now on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Javier, for your first presentation, which I heard most of, and I may have a couple of questions to pose to you in the discussion segment. Our second presenter today is Pichamon Yeophantong. Pichamon is an Australian Research Council Fellow and Senior Lecturer at the University of New South Wales, here where I'm based in Canberra, Australia. She also leads the Responsible Business Lab and Environmental Justice and Human Rights Project. Pichamon has published on the socio-political and environmental dimensions of water resources management and hydropower development in China and Southeast Asia, and is currently a chief investigator on a project that seeks to enhance women's leadership in water governance in Southeast Asia. Pichamon, can I hand to you?
Thank you very much, Michael, for that kind invitation, and also annyeonghaseyo to all of our Korean colleagues, and a good day to all of our other colleagues based in other parts of the world. First off, I would like to, of course, thank the Asia Water Council for organizing this webinar, as well as the opportunity to speak. So allow me to share my slides. What I would like to, please bear with me one moment. There's some issues here with the slide sharing. Can everyone hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yes. Okay, thank you. So what I'd like to speak to you today is about building inclusive water systems in Asia and the Pacific. Of course, this is a huge topic, one that I cannot even purport to cover in detail in 10 minutes. However, I will try my best. And to start to really talk about why inclusivity matters to water resources management in Asia and the Pacific. Of course, we all know that inclusivity matters because it pertains or impinges directly on human security, environmental security. It is also an inherently cross-cutting issue, and especially given that it's not just a matter of justice or fairness, it's also about the cost effectiveness, or it impinges on the cost effectiveness of water resource management programs, projects, and the system itself. And especially given the impacts of COVID-19 on social protection, but also for water resources management in the region, inclusivity matters more now so than ever before. We know that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected women, Indigenous communities, peoples with disabilities, amongst other marginalized groups. And for this reason, it is imperative that we understand how inclusion as well as exclusion works, but also what it now looks like in the post-COVID-19 era. At the same time, if you look at the Australian Water Partnership has supported the COVID-19 Water Security Risk Index. If we look across the region, we can see how COVID-19 has also spotlighted the importance of water-based interventions to combating COVID-19, to preventing it, but also to countries' recovery responses. So in this regard, inclusivity is, again, imperative because it is integral to the success, to the effectiveness of these interventions. In order to understand inclusivity, however, we must first understand the forms of exclusion that we see in the region. And I am, of course, generalizing here a bit, but based on surveys of the literature, but also based on interviews with stakeholders in Southeast Asia, as well as beyond, it is clear that these four forms of exclusion tend to come up the most. And of course, when we talk about exclusion, it really tends to center on how clean water is accessed, used, and allocated both between and among different sectors, groups, and geographical areas. At the same time, one of the most common complaints that I've heard, to put it that way, from stakeholders is often the fact that exclusion comes through the policy and decision-making processes. And as a result, it becomes very firmly embedded in the programs and the projects that these processes then give rise to. I won't go into every single point here, and again, in light of time constraints, but just to give you one very brief but practical example of how exclusion happens, speaking to local stakeholders in Laos, for instance, They raised the issue of how women involved in the water governance space in Laos were, for example, often they might be invited to attend formal fora or meetings on water policy, but their voices aren't heard. They might say things, but they're not listened to. And this speaks not only to the kind of the causes of exclusion and the barriers to inclusion, but it also speaks more fundamentally to some of the social and cultural norms that we find in Lao society. And so for this reason, it becomes an issue that exists not only at the political or the implementation level, but also exists within the social and cultural fabric of societies. And so this really brings me to the major causes of exclusion and barriers to inclusion in the region. My colleague and I had conducted or written up this report for International Rivers, an NGO, and Oxfam on the state of women and rivers in the Mekong region. And in it, we identified 4 key dimensions where we often see barriers to inclusion arise. And these are barriers, again, that are faced not only by women, but also by Indigenous communities, peoples with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. And again, I won't have the time to go into each of these in great detail. But again, to go back to that previous example I was giving, it's not just formal institutions where we see barriers arise. It can also exist in the informal sphere, where cultural and social norms, beliefs, and practices enable exclusionary practices. At the same time, many of my stakeholders in Laos, as well as in other countries in Southeast Asia, would often point to how access to information is inherently asymmetrical, but also it's not just the access, it's also the creation of knowledge. And so for people belonging to marginalized groups, they often make the point that knowledge about water and about water governance needs to not only be technical in nature, it also needs to speak to the lived experiences, the indigenous knowledge that communities, but also people from other ethnic groups and so forth can bring to the table as well. And these need to be given the same amount of importance and heed as technical knowledge that we gain from more scientific outlets and individuals. At the same time, however, one point that I do want to raise very quickly is the problem of intersectionality. And I think that currently in discussions about inclusivity in water resources management, we don't pay enough attention to this issue of intersectionality, which refers to how race, class, ethnicities, gender can all intersect and interact in ways that complicate people's lived realities. And this has created challenges to certain groups that, again, build up even more barriers to their involvement in the water resource management space, but it also poses challenges to organizations that are trying to deepen stakeholder engagement and participation. And certainly we now see NGOs in particular, resource-strapped NGOs post-COVID-19 that are struggling to manage the need to triage their priorities and to focus not just on gender inclusivity, for example, but also to consider other stakeholder groups that are marginalized, including youth groups, and again, peoples with disabilities and Indigenous communities. So at this point, I will go through this quite quickly, but I did want to raise what I believe are some of the key principles and enablers for inclusivity in a water system. And here, I think the main point to take away is that the operating and tandem principles that are applied to any water system, in order to determine whether or not it gives rise to inclusivity, we need to consider whether or not that water system helps to establish local and collective identities and ownership, but also whether it protects human rights and well-being. And this inherently speaks to a capability approach, an approach that focuses on not just systematic level considerations, but also the build-up of individual capabilities to ensure that that inclusivity or those tools are actually sustainable and are owned by the individuals that are affected by these water interventions and programs. At the same time, again, I will not go into too much depth, but it's also important to note that there are enabling factors that allow for greater inclusivity within a water system, and that these factors give rise to necessary but not sufficient conditions. Here, of course, as you might expect, you have access to information and knowledge creation, voice and participation, equality on the basis of fairness, accountability and transparency, and one that I would like to make a particular point of, which is context sensitivity and the self-reflexivity of water entrepreneurs. And this really simply speaks to the fact that in the implementation of any water programming or intervention, it is imperative that local conditions are taken into account, but that water entrepreneurs involved and donors involved take into account their implicit biases and also the impacts that their projects have, whether intentional or unintentional, on so-called end users. So I know that a lot of this sounds very abstract. It sounds, as some people here might think, good on paper, but what does it actually mean when it comes to actual implementation? I'm very much aware that I am nearly out of time, so I will go through this as quickly as possible. I think there are some points that we need to consider when we try to implement inclusivity in any water system. First, we need to acknowledge that water resources management is not about outcomes, it's about process, and it's about quality process. And this means that we need to focus on quality implementation and target setting, not just about standard setting and compliant box ticking. And this is a complaint that I've often heard from stakeholders that I've spoken to in the region. At the same time, we need to focus on meaningful participation, not just on disaggregated statistical data points and numbers. How many women are in the room? It's really about what they say and whether or not we give heed and credence to what they say. At the same time, we need to understand that exclusion and inclusion are really two sides of the same coin. And especially in the water resources management sector, where we don't see inclusivity come through as strongly as in the water, health and sanitation sector, it is really important to understand that where you have inclusion, you will also have exclusion, and to try and understand those dynamics. And finally, for this reason, we need to focus on excavating patterns of exclusion, as well as to try and bring up cases of good practice as well, because I think those are particularly lacking. And there is, of course, a tendency to focus on the negatives. But what this really speaks to is the need for more data, the need for more aggregated baseline data on what the nature of social inclusion and exclusion looks like currently in the Asia Pacific region. So really, I would like to end this presentation with, in one sense, a call to arms for greater investment in expanding the access to information, as well as opening up opportunities to co-create knowledge together on how inclusion can be improved in the water resources management space. So I will end there, but I look forward to your questions during the Q&A and to continuing this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pichamon. We love calls to arms, so that's welcome, and I hope that prompts some questions in the Q&A. Next, I would like to introduce our third presenter, Isnani Murdi Hertanto, works for the Directorate System and Strategy of Water Resources Management in the Ministry of Public Works and Housing for Indonesia. His everyday work is to develop plans and strategies in water resources management, especially for midterm planning, the next 2 to 5 years. In the webinar, he'll share and discuss with us water security, especially in small islands where water security is fragile and prone to external impacts. He'll also share his experience and advice about water resources management in Indonesia and its islands. Over to you, Isnani.
In this occasion, I will talk about this water security in the small island developing states. Of course, this one is a quite big topic here, so I will share a bit of my knowledge, and we can continue with the first question or another occasion. Here is the definition of the water security. We have several definitions here. We have the UN Water in 2013, the capacity of a population to safeguard sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality water for sustaining livelihood, human well-being, and social economic development, and for ensuring protection against waterborne pollution and water-related disasters, and for preserving ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. That's from the UN. And we have also from the ADB, it's in the up to 2020, it's quite new. It's just come out last December. And we have also in our country, we have also our definition. It's a fulfillment of the needs for proper and sustainable water for life and the ability to reduce water-related risk. As we can see, this definition is quite similar, but there is some unique in there. So this water security definition is quite depends on the condition of the water resource in that location, and also this international issues that are emerged or that are quite big in that era, and also political and social interests and views, and also what they think what will come to the water impacting the life and so on. This is the two definitions that I present in the last slides from UN Water and this from the ADB. This UN Water is concentrating, or it's divided into four. There's drinking water and human well-beings, and then ecosystems and water-related hazard, and also economic activities. Well, the ASEAN Water Development Outlook here, they divided into five key dimensions. They say that the first one is for rural household water security. The second one is for economics. The third one is about urban water. And the fourth one is environmental. And the last one is water-related disasters. And this is the one that we are developing now in Indonesia. We divide the water security in three index here, three key dimensions. The first one is for conservation. The second one is utilization. And the last one is control of water destructive force. But these three pillars, as we call it, it's supported by two additional pillars. It's water resource information systems and community participations. These five pillars each have these indicators. It's just like what we see in the ASEAN Water Outlook. There is also indicators in each dimension, and we measure this a bit differently, but I think it's still similar. Sorry. This is a bit about Indonesian. Of course, you can find it in the internet and so on. But Indonesia is quite big archipelago with a huge population, and we have very complex water issues here. And we are also experiencing the common water issues like too much, too dirty, and too little. But we have the additional problems, like there is islands there, very much island, and the east side is quite low in precipitation, and the west side is quite high precipitation, and the urbanization is quite rapid grow, and most of the people is living in the Java Islands, and there are very much complex issues. And this is what we are doing in the water management and water resource. We firstly plan for 20 years with strategic plans, and then we go more details in the master plans and so on. And then the lastly is what we will do in the projects. And this is our policy in our country, and maybe I will skip to the next. This is what I found about the small islands development states. It's a group of developing islands countries that are quite vulnerable to economic, social, and environmental problems. There is 58 countries categorized as these small island development states. And the main characteristic is this is quite small country, and it's remote and limited in the access, and it's quite a narrow export base and resources, and it's quite vulnerable to global environmental challenges and external economic shocks. This also, of course, it's quite vulnerable from climate change because it's affecting the seawater, and this islands usually doesn't have very much a high ground there. The issues and challenges that I found in the literature for the small islands is this water security in this small islands development state is quite urgent problems, and that must be addressed soon and quite carefully because they have these limited resources again. And even the UN declared 2014 as the year of this SIDS, and the water sources in these islands quite small and less adaptive because they are small, and this impact from the external factor is quite severe there. And it's mostly come from water, groundwater. It's small lands, and it's floating on the salt water. And again, this climate change quite have a huge impact there. And then common environmental issues, just like degradation and so on, have more impacts on these small islands. And there is urbanization is also quite constrained because there's small areas, and waste management is quite difficult. And this is what the available potential of water resources. Firstly, of course, from the surface water, there's springs and rivers, but it's quite limited in the islands. And the groundwater is we can extract it there, but it's quite fragile and vulnerable for this over extraction and also pressure from the seawater. Rainwater harvesting is quite a promising approach because we can store the water from there, and also from the specially prepared ground. Desalination is also one of the options because it can turn the seawater to the fresh water, but it's quite expensive. Water imports, this one is one of the best solution for the lack of water in the islands, but it can be expensive if the island is fairly remote. The other water sources, of course, is water reuse. There's water, we can recycle it and we can clean it up, and then we can use as a water supply. We can also cover the islands with seed piles to confine the groundwater and prevent the sea water to come in. And also there is a alternative to build the underground reservoir. This is what I found what we can do in the small island developing states. Firstly, we need to analyze the external factors that affecting the pressure on water security. So we can analyze and we can act according to what we found it very important or the biggest factor for that influencing the water security. Secondly, is improving the uncertainty analysis. Of course, this is what we are now doing, and most of the countries also moving toward there to the analysis from uncertainty on the next days or next years and future issues, and also other problems to
Is
make
Nani Nadia.
Yes.
Am I able to ask you to wrap up in the next minute and a half or so,
Of course, of course.
please?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. The third one is wastewater management. So of course, this is quite important there because it's small islands, and the limitation and supervision of groundwater extraction. Of course, this is quite important, and use of technology like that, reverse osmosis, solar energy, and so on, and develop conservation areas and national parks to sustain the water supplies, better land use planning, and also strict enforcement. This is quite important because without the strict enforcement, we cannot ensure the water security. Strong and effective national water resource management plans. This is, of course, this AIWRM. Also, now that are coming up is adaptive measures and also disaster risk reduction. The reduction of dependencies from external resources. We can, if the island can do whatever they need by themselves, or they can strengthen the water security. And increasing awareness, of course, this is quite important because the society needs to aware about this water security and what they are vulnerable. Because without the help from the society, I think the government is quite have difficulties to obtain the good water security. Lastly, is adaptive and responsive society. Of course, this one is also related from the previous one. So society, I think now is quite important with this modern era, because without society, I think the government is quite fragile or failure. I think that's from me, Michael. Give the time back to you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Isnady. Very, very powerful and interesting presentation, and obviously you have tremendous knowledge and experience in this area, and I hope there will be questions at the end. I have advice from the Secretariat that we will continue with our session, even though we're right on an hour. We're running actually a minute over time, but due to the technical difficulties at the beginning, we're extending it. So finally, I would like to welcome our discussant, Dr. Bindu Lahani, who's President of the Resources Centre and former Vice President for Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development at the Asian Development Bank. He's also on the the Asia Water Council Board and co-chair with me, in fact, of the Strategy and Policy Special Committee. Dr. Bindu Lahani, I'd ask you to reflect a little on the presentations we've heard this afternoon and bring your own experience and perspectives to the webinar. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm not able to start the video. Is it okay? Something has gone wrong.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. Let me do without the video in that case. First, I think my takeaways are 4 words: inclusiveness, water security, financing, and knowledge, or knowledge sharing, data, information. I think the presentations were really good. And I would say today, by discussing this, we not only discuss SDG 6, I think we discuss SDG 8, which is promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth as a part of that. I think this is a very, very important agenda, water for sustainable growth. So very, very good job, especially in the post-COVID area. Now, the inclusiveness, it was very clear. It's very clear, actually, many of the nations have problem of inclusiveness, inequality. The cities do have problem. We saw that quite a bit, a lot of slums, 20, 30, 40% of the slums. And during the COVID, you could see the ones who were affected were these slums, the poor people too. So they were, on one hand, we were promoting the hand washing quite a bit, but these are the people who didn't have water to drink as well in the first place. So that we saw that. I think how vulnerable, how inclusiveness issues become important. And this continues, I think this is a very good agenda to continue for further. The water security issues, has been said before, the ADB, World Bank, UN, they all have that. They're all correct. They're saying you look at from different perspectives, the household, climate, resilience, economic aspects, public. And one of the environment, one of the things that I think we need to emphasize even more, which is not there in the developing country, the quality side. Still can't drink water from many places, and people are still boiling, etc., etc. And this is where the Javier's point come in. If you really see the cost of of the water by the time you drink it, when you put it all together, is so much more, including where I'm here. I'm willing to pay twice the price if only I could drink the water from the tap. So I think the policy questions become very relevant, and the financing. Now, on the one thing that I saw during the post-COVID period, which saw more, I should say, is while we talk quite a bit on the global regional water security, and I myself did quite a bit at the Asian Development Bank, had the first Asian water development outlook with this water security, I think we all know the solutions will almost always be at the local level. Xavier said at the sub-regional level, he's very correct, so that we can share the knowledge. And at the local country level, which the SID, the small island presentation showed how sometimes the local context becomes so different. What I'm trying to say here is that we need to, I found in this COVID period, the dealing with the mayors, the local communities, local NGOs, and getting some of the things was very, very important. I think that is a message we need to carry in the post-COVID era, and maybe some sort of having dialogue with these mayors. The city people are already doing quite a bit, because in Asia, 60 to 70% of the Asians will live in cities, 60 to 70% of the GDP will be in these cities, energy, water, food will be consumed in this city, greenhouse gas will be 60, 70% of the city. Therefore, to be an integral part of that, I think we need to be a part of this municipality in one form or the other. And I saw this, and to tie this up with the financing, what I think the OECD study is great. There have been a lot of just regional studies, many institutions. We just did one here for Nepal, what's our financing gap, but we also turn around and look at it, what it takes if you want to grow 5%. How much you need is one way is how much money you will need as a percent of the GDP. The other is if you want to grow 5%, your aspiration is 5%, how much do you need to invest in energy, transport, urban, and water? I think that was a very revealing information, just turning it around. And the climate people, in my opinion, I deal quite a bit with the climate agencies and sit in many boards. One of the things I've seen in the climate agenda, been very successful in doing green bonds. Green bond is a huge business, as you know. We did that at the ADB, World Bank, IFC. My goodness, because China did it, and so on and so forth. We haven't been able to promote that idea a lot in water. During the time when I was the ADB, we did the water bond, 2 water bond in Japan, which was very useful in locking that money for water projects. I mean, the pipeline definitely grew once we have more money on the water bond. The second thing that I'm now looking at it, that allowed me during the COVID, is to look at the municipal bond. You know, some of these municipalities are rich. They could provide better water, better infrastructure, but they don't know how to structure this. And therefore, I think Javier had this point, you need to look at the future, leverage the resources through the bonds. A municipal bond is an area where I see a lot of prospect, where small water supply projects, including the urban water project, could be done. And the third thing I saw during the post-COVID, very interestingly, was the importance of the blending the finance. I think Javier showed very much the concessional, the commercial money is not coming very much. Concessional fund, the tariff, the public sector. When you put all that grounds, you put that all together, they've started creating a town fund. We have here a town development fund, and most of the money actually goes for water, because when you pull all this different kind of money, the price is very, very low. And people are willing to borrow, municipalities are willing to borrow that, and they can pay it back through the tariff. And my last point is I think the importance of, once again, mentioning the quality, and related to that, the importance of adapting or leapfrogging, especially in the context of development country, for smart technologies. I think we've seen the importance of the value of the smart technology in reducing the water losses, and within the life cycle period of the water project, it is paid off quite a bit. Something very difficult issue which has not moved in on life cycle analysis of the technology in the decision-making process. Something I think some agencies, multilaterals, are doing it. Maybe AWC could think this as a part of its smart water program. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bindu Leflaive, who has joined us as discussant today. All right, we have time for a very brief question and answer session. I might kick it off. Just a question to Javier in response to your presentation. You say that tariffs have been, according to your research, underutilized as mechanisms. Can you talk a little bit about why you found this to be? Was it a lack of revenue collection systems, a lack of tradition in giving water an economic value, or were there poor drivers for better regulation and efficiency?
Thank you, Michael. It's really a tricky question, and of course, we would need a much more detailed and fine-grained analysis to be specific. In essence, I think a lack of strong economic regulation is probably the main driver. Strong independent economic regulation can provide the framework and incentive for the performance of water utilities, for the review of expenditure program, and for setting tariff policies that are aligned with the level of ambition of policies. And that's where I think most countries, and again, sorry for the too generic and abstract statements, but that's where most countries could benefit from more robust and independent economic regulation for water supply and sanitation services. This is not specific to Asia and the Pacific. This is obviously something, I mean, a topic that is relevant globally. But I think this is an area where sharing good lessons, sharing experience with independent economic regulators or regulation across the region or at sub-regional level would be very, very useful and could be a source of inspiration. I'll stop there, but it's a topic I would like to elaborate more if we had more time. Again, we see a lot of value in independent economic regulation when it comes to the performance of operators, the relevance of tariff policy, and the efficiency of expenditure programs.
Great, thank you very much, Javier. And I know you have to go off to another Zoom meeting, I think. So please feel free to opt out when you need to go. I've got a second question for this time for Pichamon. So Pichamon, you talked a lot about forms of exclusion, reasons for exclusion. So in your view, what part of the programming and the planning cycle at a very practical level do you think social inclusion should feature most prominently?
Thank you for that question, Michael. My research team and I have been looking, for example, at Chinese Chinese investment in the water space, looking at their hydropower investments, for instance, in Southeast Asia. And in so doing, we've been going through kind of company documents to try and gauge how monitoring and evaluation takes place, but also to what extent gender considerations feature in the initial planning stages of these large-scale hydropower schemes that clearly will have a major impact on communities, but especially on women and other marginalized and vulnerable groups in local areas. And what we found was that there is, again, a lot of talk about, for instance, gender disaggregated data, but that data doesn't get used. At the same time, there are a lot of assumptions that get made about what vulnerability, what exclusion looks like in these different locations, even though, again, we need many of these locations have different dynamics going on, so we need a context-sensitive approach. And what that really signals to me, at least, and I'm wary of overgeneralizing, but I do find that this is potentially one of the a commonality that we find not just amongst Chinese companies involved in the space, but also companies, especially from developing countries, where there's not enough that's being paid to gender inclusivity, social inclusivity considerations at the planning stage. And of course, we have impact assessments and all that, but they tend to be quite cursory or customary almost. And so there really is a need to do detailed mapping of exclusionary practices to understand, again, the patterns of exclusion that we find in different locales, and to, as a result, better understand what kind of inclusivity we actually need for that particular project in that particular location. So I'd say that the initial stages are the most important. They are what sets the tone for the entire program, and they can also set up the targets, right? The expectations of that program or that project as well. So really the initial stages are the most essential, I would say. And at the same time, of course, monitoring evaluation matters as well. And this is another issue entirely, but I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pichamon. We could have a whole seminar on monitoring and evaluation, I think. Isnani Hantato, I have a question in the chat, in fact, which you might be well placed to answer. And we only have about a minute left, so if I can ask you to keep it brief. But someone has asked in the chat, what are the secrets for engaging politicians to see clean water provision from municipalities as a top priority? What are the incentives for politicians to prioritize these issues?
Thank you, Michael. Well, politician is all about votes, right? So yeah, we come from we move from the bottom. I mean, just try to move the society to voice the concern about the water supplies, and then other will join and so on. So I think if there is many people that want the something, the politician will hear that. So I mean, the society nowadays is quite important for water, especially, and for other things. So if we can move the society to voices their concerns, so I think the politician will listen. I think that's my brief answer, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Isnani. Very on target. Thank you. I'd like to just briefly thank again all of our panel members. So Xavier Leflaive, Isnani Hantato, Pichamon Yeophantong, and our distinguished discussant, Dr. Bindu Lahani. And with that, I will hand the chair back to AWC Secretariat, our Master of Ceremonies, to conduct the wrap up and advertisement for the next events in the series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, moderator and the participants. It was very insightful and good presentation. So next our operational manager of AIWW Secretary will briefly introduce the outline of the second AIWW and the next webinar.
It's good to see you all. This is Mr. Kim Jin, who is working for
AWC Secretariat with Mr. Kim and Sophie. So I briefly introduced the coming second Asia International Water Week. It will held coming November this year, first or second week in East Labuan Bajo, Indonesia. So the main theme is sustainable, clean, and sufficient water for all. So next page. Next. Those are our main program. So especially the first three is our main program: Asia to World Statement and Asia Water Issue and Water Project Business Forum. Asia to World Statement it will be written by three different levels based on their parliamentarian, ministerial, and expert level. It is based on their duty and position. Next one is Asia Water Issue. So through this Asia AIWW on air, so we all water experts in the world and K-Water's coordinator will be modifying and gather all the experience and ideas. And in this AIWW, we have 24 sessions based on 6 themes. And last one is water projects with forum to explore water issues in Asia and match demand-based water projects with appropriate solution providers. Next. More information will be follow up on our website. If you have any inquiries and ideas, please contact us without any hesitation. We are willing to take all your ideas. Next. So we finished first webinar today, and second webinar is scheduled on after 2 weeks, 18 March 2021, 4 p.m. GMT +9. It is I'm sorry. Those three water experts will be addressed. Jongjin Wang from Tsinghua University, Mr. Han-gu Lee, Vice President of K-Water, and Mr. Fahmi Hidayat from PJ1 of Indonesia. So we look forward to your continuous and active participation in the on-air series until June by sharing your experience and creative ideas that will contribute to resolve water issues in Asia and beyond with tangible solutions. Please also promote the on-air with your friends, members, and your colleagues to raise global interest in the second AIWW. Thank you.
Thank you, Operational Manager. Now we come to the final stage. Our Vice Executive President who will give us the closing remarks. Now.
오늘 지속 가능한 성장을 위한 물관리를 주제로 고귀한 의견을 나눠주셔서 감사합니다. 4차 산업혁명과 더불어 디지털 전환, 뉴노멀, 기후위기로 대변되는 이 시대에는 물 안보가 경제, 사회의 지속 가능한 발전을 위해서 반드시 해결해야 하는 인류 공동의 과제입니다. 오늘 발표에서 말씀하신 것처럼 우리는 물 관련 정책, 투자를 물 안보 관점에 다시 한번 되돌아보고 미래의 물 문제에 대응하기 위해 새로운 기술 정책의 발굴을 시행을 위해 더욱 노력해야 될 것입니다. 아시아 워터 이슈 세션이 아시아 국제 물주간의 선구적 개최와 전 세계 물 문제 해결, 글로벌 2030 목표 달성을 위한 소중한 밑거름이 되리라 생각합니다. 오늘을 시작으로 이어지는 5개 주제의 세션도 성공적으로 진행되기를 바라겠습니다. 다시 한번 참석해 주신 여러분들께 진심으로 감사드립니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Executive Vice President, and thank you all the participants and the panelists. I think it was a very useful session. So the summary of the first webinar will be disseminated through your email, and if for those who want to see the forum again, you can contact to the YouTube channel of AWC, Asia Water Council, and we will upload this sooner or later. So thank you for participants joining today's event. we promise to next event will be better than this because this is the first time. So we kindly request your understanding. So what happened, some mistakes or problems today. So this will officially conclude our first webinar, and we are looking forward to all of you next webinar. Bye.